Welcome and thank you for joining me today. Imagine a night where the ocean was calm, the stars were bright, and humanity's greatest engineering marvel sailed under a cloak of invincibility. Yet, in just a few short hours, that same ship would become a haunting symbol of tragedy and loss. This is the story of the Titanic, a tale filled with ambition, hubris, and heartbreak. It's a story you may think you know, but there are details hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. So settle in, because what happened on that fateful April night over a century ago still resonates deeply today. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic, the world's largest and most luxurious unsinkable ship, struck an iceberg and sank in just under 3 hours. Immortalized in the movie Titanic, these rare photos give us a glimpse into what really happened that fateful night. Built using steel rivets, the Titanic was the latest technology of the time. Sadly, her maiden voyage became her last. But despite how famous the liner and its story might be, there are many interesting facts and details about the doomed vessel that you may not know. As we step back into history and recall the true events surrounding the construction, voyage, and sinking of the Titanic, we will unearth many interesting facts you might not have known. For its time, the Titanic was massive, although today would seem relatively small compared to modern cruise ships. The Titanic was nearly 883 ft long and 4 ft tall. It had 10 decks and 3 main engines that were powered by steam from 29 boilers and 159 furnaces. There are many details about Titanic's lifeboats that would be called into question following the sinking of the ship. There were a total of 20 lifeboats aboard the Titanic, but there could have been up to 64 had the Titanic been fully stocked. 64 lifeboats could have saved as many as 4,000 people, more than the ship's total capacity. What many people don't know is that the Titanic actually had more lifeboats than legally required at the time. Lifeboats were considered a means to transport people from a sinking ship to a rescue ship, why they were not considered to be a means to keep every single passenger from drowning or falling into the sea. Titanic's home port was Liverpool, but it departed from Southampton due to its more advantageous location. At the time of its maiden voyage, the plan was for the ship to frequently travel between Southampton and New York. Because the Titanic was so large, a special deep water dock was constructed to accommodate the Titanic. Had a total of 885 crew members, 97% of which were male. The vast majority of these crew members were just temporary workers who first boarded the ship shortly before it left Southampton on its Manette's maiden voyage. The largest department was the engine crew, which had 325 workers. The captain of the Titanic was Edward Smith. Smith had been captain of the Olympic, a sister ship to the Titanic, in 1911. The Olympic crashed into a British warship. Although the damage was considerable, the Olympic did not sink and was able to return to Southampton. The British Navy blamed the Olympic for the incident. There were 1,317 passengers aboard the Titanic, the majority of whom were in third class. 66% of these passengers were male and 34% were female. But among the first-class passengers were some famous or notable historical figures, such as John Jacob Astor Ivy, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, Archibald Gracie, and William Thomas Stadd. A Titanic began its first voyage at noon on April 10, 1912. Within minutes, it nearly caused an accident. The Titanic caused another ship's mooring cables to snap, causing the ship to nearly collide with the Titanic. Thankfully, a nearby tugboat was able to gain control of the unoared ship and avert disaster. The Titanic first made its way to the French port of Cherbourg, 77 nautical miles away from Southampton. Since the two last known photos were taken by Francis Brown, a Jesuit trainee in Kehl, a Titanic was scheduled to arrive and drive in New York on April 17th. For 3 days while traveling from Queenstown to New York, there were no major incidents aboard the ship. All seemed to be going well, but Captain Smith received some pressing warnings from other ships that he ignored. The Titanic received warnings from other ships of drifting ice near the Grand Banks of Newland. Despite these warnings, the Titanic continued at full speed ahead, which was considered appropriate action at the time. Warnings of ice were seen as advisories to be noted by lookouts in the bridge who were tasked with sighting any dangerous icebergs. Although it seems obvious in retrospect that precautionary measures should have been taken, Captain Smith was not terribly concerned about icebergs. While on board the Titanic, the belief at the time was that ships like the Titanic would not sink even if they hit an iceberg. On April 14th at nearly midnight, a lookout spotted an iceberg in front of the Titanic and alerted the bridge. The order was made from the bridge to steer around the iceberg, but it was too late. The starboard side of the Titanic was struck by the iceberg and dented so severely that a hole allowed water to enter the ship. As water began filling up the Titanic, 5 compartments were flooded, which meant disaster, as only 4 could be flooded without catastrophe. The ship soon began sinking bow first. Because lifeboats were intended only to transport passengers to rescue ships, there were not nearly enough aboard to save all the passengers. As the Titanic began to sink, crew members began loading people onto lifeboats. Unfortunately, these crew members were not well trained and did not know how many people could safely get onto each lifeboat. Thus, some lifeboats were sent out only half full. Third-class passengers were largely ignored and were forced to try to save themselves as their cabins filled with cold water. Protocol at the time dictated that women and children be saved first during an emergency. This resulted in about 75% of women on board the Titanic being saved and around 50% of children being saved. Only about 20% of the adult man aborts men aboard the ship, passengers and crew members included. At a little eddy after 2 a.m. in the morning, 2 hours after the ship first hit an iceberg, the Titanic split in half. The bow completely sank, but the stern remained above water, eventually becoming almost vertical as it was slowly dragged into the depths by the bow section of the ship. While many people might think that the Titanic passengers died of hypothermia, in fact, most of them died from cardiac arrest. These deaths would have occurred within roughly 15 to 30 minutes. Although the lifeboats nearby had room for around 500 additional passengers, they did not return to the sinking ship to save anyone. The Titanic sent up several distress signals including flares, but none of the ships that were relatively close to the Titanic could reach it before it sank. The closest ship was the Californian, which saw the flare shot up by the Titanic, but didn't make an attempt to save any of the drowning passengers. In the end, an estimated 1,517 people died as a result of the Titanic sinking. As the Carpathia traveled to New York, it sent word of the event B back to the outside world. By the time the Carpathia reached New York with the survivors, the public was hungry to learn more about what had happened. Reporters quickly interviewed survivors to hear their stories. It took 4 days to complete a list of the survivors, leaving some family members in a state of anguish as they didn't know whether their loved ones had lived or died. 2 investigations were quickly launched, one in the United States and one in the United Kingdom, to determine the cause of the disaster. Both reached similar conclusions, blaming laws and policies surrounding lifeboats, Captain Smith's failure to be concerned about warnings of icebergs, and the ship's rapid speed. And the wreck of the Titanic lies approximately 12,000 ft below the water's surface, making it extraordinarily difficult to find. It wasn't until 1985 that it was finally discovered. Although many people believed at the time that the Titanic was unsinkable, the ship's builders never actually quite called it that. Even they knew there was always a risk of disaster, albeit in their view, very minuscule. They described instead the Titanic as practically unsinkable, a false and perhaps arrogant statement, but still not quite the same as declaring it unsinkable.